Let's talk about words. Because words are not just words. They're not empty sounds or passive ink on paper. They shape perceptions. They forge narratives. They build consensus or they destroy it. They are how empires speak without ever raising a sword, and how those empires justify it when they do. Words are weapons. They decide who is the victim and who is the threat. They decide whose death deserves global mourning and whose murder gets tucked between the commercial breaks. Words are shields. They conceal state violence behind layers of sanitized jargon. They take the sting out of atrocity, turn war crimes into military operations, and make occupation sound like security. Words are strategy. They don't just describe the world, they program how you see it. They slip past your logic and nestle inside your instincts. And once they're in, they begin to whisper. They whisper that some people are just dangerous by nature, that some regions are always volatile, and that some lives, some nations, just come with more bloodshed than others. And here's the truth no Western newsroom will admit. In the hands of Western media, words become the front line of warfare. Not metaphorically, literally. They prepare you for war. They soften you to suffering. They make foreign cruelty feel distant and domestic violence feel justified. Because long before the missiles fly, before the tanks roll in, before the sanctions cripple populations, there is always a media campaign. There's always a language shift. There's always a vocabulary designed to make violence look just like virtue. On the battlefield, it's not in Gaza, it's not in Kyiv, it's not in Tehran. It's your mind, your perception, your instincts, your ability to separate truth from propaganda. Now, ask any editor-in-chief or white-collar news anchor, and they'll give you the standard line. We're just reporting the news. We're neutral. We inform. We don't influence. But if that is true, why is it that the exact same act, say, firing a rocket or invading a territory, is described in two completely different ways depending on who did it? Why is it that resistance is a noble struggle in Ukraine, for example, but in Gaza, it's an act of terrorism? Why is it when a white Westerner kills, headlines are always searching for motives, talking about mental health, giving us a backstory? But when a brown Muslim kills, the word terrorist is already printed before the facts are known. You see, you don't need to drop bombs to shape a battlefield. You just have to control the narrative. You just have to decide what counts as terror and what doesn't. Spoiler, it's never Western. What counts as a life and what doesn't. Hint, some lives get obituaries, others get numbers. And what counts as self-defense? Only when the West or its allies strike first. And what can never be self-defense, especially if it's coming from those labeled enemies. This isn't just hypocrisy, it is precision propaganda. It is the weaponization of vocabulary in service of empire. And nowhere is this double standard more visible, more lethal, more morally bankrupt than how Western media tells the story of war, occupation, and empire. So let's walk through it together. Let's peel back the headlines and look past the carefully chosen words and into the political motives beneath. Let's talk about the selective outrage, why some bombings spark global protests, while others don't even make the news. Let's expose, while we're at it, the moral gymnastics, how war crimes are condemned or excused based on nothing more than a flag or a passport. And let's finally decode the language of power, the kind that doesn't shout, it whispers, it omits, it gaslights, and worst of all, it convinces good people to cheer for bad things. Because the question isn't whether media influences war. The question is, how many wars would never have happened if the media hadn't sold them to us first? When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the response from Western media was instant and intense. It wasn't just breaking news, it was moral theater. Anchor desks became war rooms. Reporters rushed to Kyiv in flak jackets, standing in front of sandbags, air raid sirens, broadcasting live from underground shelters. Social media feeds were plastered with Ukrainian flags. Headlines roared across every outlet. Unprovoked attack, illegal invasion, violation of international law, war crimes. And let me be clear though, they weren't wrong. It was an invasion. It was illegal under international law. It was a war crime carried out by an authoritarian regime bent on crushing a sovereign people. That's not the point. The point is not whether Russia deserved condemnation. It did. Absolutely it did. The point is, why is that condemnation so selective? Why is it that some acts of aggression trigger wall-to-wall coverage, international sanctions, celebrity statements, and mass public sympathy, while others barely make the evening news? Why is it that some people's suffering is sacred, while others is negotiable. Because when Russia bombed the maternity hospital in Mariupol, it was immediately called a war crime. When images of pregnant women, bloodied and terrified, being stretchered out of rubble hit the screen, there was no debate, no both sides, no Israeli-style "was there a Hamas cell hiding under the hospital" follow-up. It was horror, period. The kind of horror that demanded justice, that demanded remembrance. But when Israel bombed hospitals in Gaza, killing hundreds, what did Western media say? Unconfirmed, unverified. According to Hamas-run sources, Israel says, fog of war. Suddenly, the same media that trusted the Ukrainian Ministry of Health couldn't trust Palestinian doctors who were pulling charred children out of rubble on live TV. Suddenly, hospital workers became Hamas affiliates, and every cratered nursery needed to be independently verified by 3 satellites and a NATO spokesperson before it could be called a tragedy. This isn't journalism. This is judicial empathy, distributed only to those deemed worthy of it. Let's keep going. When Ukrainians picked up arms to defend their homes, they were hailed as heroes. Grandmothers with rifles were profiled on the BBC. Molotov cocktail tutorials were aired on CNN. Zelensky, a wartime president, was given standing ovations in parliaments around the world. When Palestinians, under military occupation, under siege, denied basic rights, dared to resist, they're called terrorists, militants, human shields even. Let's not forget that in 2022, the New York Times published a glowing profile titled "The Ukrainian Resistance Fighters Risking Everything." Meanwhile, that same paper has never, not once, profiled a Palestinian family whose home was bulldozed by settlers, or whose son was arrested at 13, or whose daughter was killed with a US-supplied sniper bullet. When Palestinians resist with stones, they're violent. When Ukrainians resist with US missiles, they're freedom fighters. It's the same act, but a different story depending on the color of your passport or the color of your skin. And here's the line that gave the whole game away. It came from a CNN anchor live on air watching Ukrainian refugees pour into Poland. These are not refugees from Syria, he emotionally declared. These are Christians. They're white. They're very similar to us. There it is, out in the open. Not dog whistle racism, megaphone racism. This wasn't about universal values. This was about tribal identification dressed up as humanitarianism. Because apparently, you have to be white, Christian, and similar to us to matter. Syrians, bombed and blockaded for a decade, too brown. Yemenis, starved with US and British weapons, too far away. Palestinians, living under siege for 17 years, too inconvenient. That's not journalism. That's a racial hierarchy of empathy. That is an apartheid of emotions. That's the quiet calculus Western media makes every day. Whose children deserve to be saved, whose parents deserve to be heard, whose suffering is real, and whose is just noise. Because at some point, the story stops being about what's happening and starts being about to whom it's happening. And when that happens, the entire framework collapses. Because you cannot claim objectivity while your cameras linger longer in Kiev than in Khan Yunis. You can't claim neutrality when you call one side's dead innocents and the other side's human shields. You can't claim to inform when your language does the very work of war, dehumanizing some, sanctifying others, and laundering state violence into righteous necessity. So yes, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was evil, but the question Western media need to answer is, why does evil only have a name when it's not spelled with Latin letters? So let's talk about October the 7th. Because yes, Hamas committed atrocities that day. Israeli civilians were killed, families were massacred, people were kidnapped. The footage was horrific, the acts were indefensible, and the Western media didn't just condemn Hamas, it didn't just cover the violence. It declared a narrative war and lost its collective mind in the process. Context? Gone. History? Erased. Colonialism redacted, occupation never even acknowledged. Suddenly, 75 years of systemic dispossession vanished. 75 years of stolen land, demolished homes, imprisoned children, and blockaded cities, forgotten overnight. The forced expulsions of Palestinians in 1948, the occupation of the West Bank since 1967, the illegal settlements growing every year, the siege of Gaza since 2007, all erased, rewritten, whitewashed. Western media performed an astonishing sleight of hand and turned a brutal political tragedy with a century of historical roots into a binary morality play. Israel equals civilization, Palestinians equal terror. Overnight, the entire Palestinian population was placed under a moral quarantine. Not just Hamas, Palestinians. Civilians were just caught in the crossfire, they were recast as part of the crossfire. Every man was a suspected militant, every woman was a probable accomplice, every child future Hamas recruit. Because suddenly, every building in Gaza became a Hamas command center. Every school had a tunnel beneath it. Every hospital was a hideout. Every residential block a legitimate military target. Please, let's be clear about this. This was not journalism. This was the militarization of language. When a civilian population is portrayed as indistinguishable from militants, that is the groundwork for dehumanization.